Hello, and a very warm welcome to everybody out there on our very exciting hour that we have ahead, because our webinar today is taking us on a summer holiday driving across Europe. Now, this event has been brought together by GEM Motoring Assist and the Older Drivers Forum. My name is Valerie Singleton, as Rob's just said, and I shall be your guide on what promises to be a rather exciting 60 minutes ahead, full of adventure and discovery. Oh, and also, let's hope, some practical advice along the way. We've got some really great guests for you to meet. We're going to meet Neil Barrett, first of all. Now, Neil is a technology expert and a contributor to the Good Motoring magazine, and he's just done a most amazing drive all the way up to the northernmost point of Europe in an electric car and back. 7 countries in all that he came through. So we're going to hear all about that, and he'll give you some practical advice about what it's like touring in an EV. And then later in the programme, he's also going to talk to us about hiring a car when we go abroad, how to cope with car rental companies. We're also going to be meeting Dr. Alan Wakely. Alan is a historian, also a contributor to the Good Motoring magazine, and he's going to explain some of the best ways to explore in France, with particular reference to finding some of the key locations that relate to, of course, the 2 world wars. We're going to meet Kevin and Tracy Field. Now, they've created a rather interesting podcast called the Confident Drivers Podcast. So if you're at all anxious about driving abroad, then they'll be able to sort of give you some tips on calming your nerves and boosting your confidence a bit. James Luckhurst, the editor of the Good Motoring magazine, will share his experiences of driving recently across Europe, in France, to the Alps. And he's also going to show us a selection of some rather unusual traffic rules that he came across on that journey. We're then going to meet Keith Smith-Dutton. Keith is also a GEM member, and he's also a very enthusiastic and experienced person with motorhomes. Keith has taken motorhomes all over the UK and all over Europe, and he's going to be sharing some of his ideas about driving on the roads and also some night stopping, which is always, I would think, quite a problem if you're driving a motorhome. He's also going to share some of his experiences of his holiday memories in motorhomes. So some really great, interesting speakers that we've got for you in the next hour. So, and hopefully at the very end, we hope very much that we might have a few questions that you've already submitted that we can sort of put to our various speakers. So let's get started immediately with technology journalist and consultant Neil Barrett, who last year drove his Tesla all the way through the Scandinavian countries. I think probably he got so far almost to the North Pole, probably knows just about every charging point in that part of the world. That sounds a pretty amazing journey, Neil. How long did it take you, and what sort of experiences did you have?
Well, Valerie, hello. 3 weeks of mountains, fjords, lots of plugging in, as you've said. We went 8,000 kilometers, so 5,000 miles, and we went to the topmost point, the most northerly point of mainland Europe, which is the North Cape at the top of Norway. So a long drive, whizzing through, I have to say, France and Belgium and the Netherlands and Germany, then onto a ferry across to Denmark, and then from there, lots of Scandinavian fun. We sort of did an anti-clockwise loop, if you can picture that. So we sort of went up through Sweden and then Finland, and then around the top there and down the west coast of Norway. So yeah, a wonderful 3 weeks, but very whistle stop. And of course, with 24-hour daylight, it meant that we could drive a bit later into the evening than we would normally.
Now, what I want to know is, did you have to plan ahead where all those chargers were and where you'd be able to stop and charge your Tesla?
Well, the answer is no. We didn't plan anything until that morning. So we'd have a look in the car, and like a lot of electric cars, Teslas have very good sat navs, so we could look at where the chargers were. But we made a point of not checking any maps before the day itself. So we would work out where we were going and roughly where we would charge on the way. And the main reason for that is Norway in particular has got a very, very good take up of electric chargers and electric vehicles. So one statistic that I've heard is somewhere between 75 and 80% of cars sold in Norway last year were electric vehicles. Compare that to sort of closer to home, and it's nowhere near. So they're very, very forward thinking with their EV take up. And you only have to look at how old some of the electric vehicles are that you see on the road up there to know that they've been doing that sort of thing for a very long time.
Was there a lot of queuing at the chargers?
No, there will perhaps one or two in the more rural areas, and you can imagine how rural it is if you haven't been, at the top of Scandinavia. One or two, I think in the whole 3 weeks, we found one, possibly a maximum of two, I think, broken chargers. So in terms of queues and faults and that sort of thing, no, we were good to go. I think a lot of tourist traffic at the very top of Scandinavia is in the winter, Northern Lights, snow, that sort of thing. So in a strange way, it feels oddly off season in the summer. So it's a quieter time to go if you want to sort of get those charges in without queuing.
Now, something I didn't know is that you can actually decide the speed with which you charge your car. Could you do that so you can, perhaps take it longer and go off and explore somewhere? Did you take advantage of that?
Yeah, you can, and there's a word of caution about it, which I'll say in a minute. Now, I think one of the tips around stopping to charge is don't stop to charge just for the sake of it, and that probably sounds obvious, but it's worth thinking where you're going to stop for what you're going to do. If it's a restaurant, even a comfort break, or to look at the scenery is the best thing. To actually, you may as well multitask and do two things at the same time. Now, where you've got a charger, a large bank of chargers, which clearly isn't going to get all used, or where you're perhaps in a holiday home, a guest house, and that charger is being provided just for you, there's no other electric cars staying that night, you can, with some EVs, slow down the charge, and you can slow down the charge quite significantly. So you can up to sort of double the amount of time that you're spending at a charging stop. Obviously, the word of caution is to say don't do that where it's busy, because you'll upset quite a few people that are queuing up behind you. But for those stops that are completely out of the way, you could really make the most of the experience just by dialing down the charging speed a little bit. Now, not all cars do that, not all chargers do that, but there's quite a few. For example, I'll give my Tesla as an example. If you go to a Tesla, what they call the supercharger, their own brand of charger, it's all set up for you. So you can set how much you want to charge up to the battery, 80, 90%, whatever. You can't change the speed really though. But if you're plugging that car into a different charger, perhaps one provided by the local authorities or what have you, then yes, you can adjust the speed. So as long as you do it in a responsible way, you can sort of optimize your stay, if I can put it that way.
Is it costly charging there? Is it different from us?
Yeah, I mean, yes, it's a lot cheaper. I didn't look into why. It's subsidized, and you kind of think that, especially in Norway, where the take up is so high, and they're provided loans. I know there's been grants in the UK before, interest-free loans in Scotland, that sort of thing. So I think probably a similar thing was going on there. But in terms of the prices as well, I think in one case it took something like half the price paying for exactly the same type of charger at home. The other thing, we did the maths at the end. Of course, you've got to work out the maths. We've got the spreadsheets out. I think we paid about 8p a mile to do the whole trip. So compare that to petrol cars and that sort of thing. I think we did it pretty economically.
What about motorways? I mean, is there any exemption on motorways for electric cars? Or do you
There
have
are.
to pay for all the motorways?
Well, you can get things a bit cheaper. There's some of the local areas, just like the UK, split up into counties and local areas, and they have different policies. But you can get things a bit cheaper if you're an electric car. Exemptions do happen sometimes with either car parking or motorway tolls or bridge tolls or that sort of thing. But usually what you find is it's maybe 10 or 20% cheaper. So if you're driving a car that you're bringing in from the UK, obviously you have to register that car, and they'll ask you to send the logbook, the V5C certificate off to prove that it's an electric car. But that's a case of just scanning it in and sending it across in an email or whatever. And once you've done that once, you're on their books, you're on their system, and they've got your discount applied. Of course, they know where to find you if you get caught speeding too, so be careful.
Now, what about cities? You come into cities. I mean, how sort of are they prepared for you turning up in an electric car? Are they all right? Is it easy to find chargers there?
It's the same problem worldwide, that it's getting the electric power into the right places in the cities and then finding the space to put a bank of maybe 10 or 20 chargers. So it can be a bit of a challenge. And of course, the problem you've got also is getting into that city and looking at whether there's congestion charges or tolls or that sort of thing. My advice would be to try and charge outside of cities. If you're staying overnight somewhere at one of the main hotels, they've got electric facilities, great. But other than that, try and charge on the road, because again, you can enjoy the scenery as well.
I think it's absolutely fantastic that you didn't know where all the chargers were going to be and you just chanced your luck. I think that's amazing. And you say the roads are amazing there too. You were telling me about the roads earlier, about how brilliant they are there and how everybody rushes out if there's any damage from storms or anything like that.
Yeah, while we were out there, there was a Storm Hans, I think it was. It's a really major event, and it was the first time my phone had ever had that emergency alert. You know, where you get the siren, and I think we tested it in the UK last year. I think it was around sort of around this time of year, and we had that big alert, and it made I think it didn't work on everybody's phone, but it was that siren that you couldn't really switch off, and it was on phones and iPads and watches and that sort of thing. We had that for the first time out there, and I thought, well, are they a bit just overcautious out there, or do they just sort of do it a bit too often, a bit trigger happy with it? But I checked with the hotel, and it was actually the biggest storm they'd had in about 21 years. But as I was saying to you earlier, Valerie, the thing I noticed was the next morning there were so many workmen out on the street, teams of people, men and women from all over the area, just work together, from councils, from the motorway maintenance people. It just seems to be a joined up approach where they get onto the road the next morning, fix it, because of course you had, with the rain, some of those let's say cheaper bridges and things, if you like, had sort of sunk, and they were out there repairing those. They'd obviously have a list of the key routes, because I think it's like sort of rural America, in that there's very few roads and they're very long distance roads. So if something goes wrong with one of those, the diversion route is, hours rather than minutes. So they really have a list of key routes that they work on. But it was the next morning, and I think that was what struck me. We weren't waiting sort of a couple of weeks for someone to come and assess the damage, and then someone to spray paint a circle around it, and then someone to come and fill it in. It was just done the next morning. So I must say, I was quite impressed with that. And again, I'd highlight sort of Norway and Finland for that in particular.
Sounds like we could learn a lot from them. Now, just want to know quickly, are you going to write a book, or are we going to get some rather nice, interesting articles from you soon?
Well, we've got a website, epicevexplorer.com, and there's some social media channels. It's on YouTube. So we kind of blogged and we filmed as we went along, plenty of photos on there. So if people want to get some inspiration from the trip, that would be very flattering if people do get inspired by it, and they're welcome to look on those channels. As for a book,
what's the link, Neil?
So it's epicevexplorer.com is the website, and then on the social channels, it's just at epicevexplorer. And maybe there's a good motoring magazine piece there to come at some point as well. Who knows?
Well, it sounds an absolutely fantastic trip, really very exciting. And we're going to hear from you again a little bit later, Neil, when you're going to give us some advice about hiring cars when we go abroad. Thank you.
Yes, see you soon.
Yeah, we look forward to it. We're going to move on now to my next guest, who is Dr. Alan Wakely, historian, retired schoolmaster, and also a good motoring writer and contributor. Now, Alan is particularly interested in the two world wars, the First and the Second World War, and he's going to talk now about how we can visit both France, northern France, and Belgium, and tell us sort of some of the main points and places that we should really look out for associated with the two world wars. So, Alan, a very warm welcome indeed. Now, first of all, what historical significance do the battlefields of northern France have, especially relating to the two world wars, the First and Second World War?
The battlefields in northern France, in particular, relate to the First War, it has to be said. There were a great deal more casualties in military terms in the First War than the Second. And as you travel through along the motorways in northern France, down the A26 and A1 to Paris and beyond, as I think James will be talking about later, you can see from the sides just how many groups of graves there are, little cemeteries. The whole of the countryside was so devastated by World War I, and there's a permanent record of that in these cemeteries. There are rather fewer relating to World War II, because there were fewer casualties in that area. The enemy, the Germans, arrived in 1940, occupied France, and then eventually, from D-Day onwards in 1944, the Allies swept back. But it was very much a throughput. It didn't get anchored for so long, and so there's not as much to see, and nor, frankly, as many graves or as many museums. And an awful lot of people go over because they think they've got relations there.
Yeah,
somewhere.
of course. Yeah. How accessible are these sites? And in a way, what's the best sort of way to see them? I mean, in a car or doing a tour with somebody? What would be the best way to access them?
There can be access problems, because the graves were created initially where the people fell, or very close to the areas where people fell. And although the museums all have reasonable car access, going to a particular grave can be quite a walk on occasions. They have improved lately, and there are plenty of signage, good signage, indicating where to park. And of course, you can look up a particular grave and sat-navs in France and Belgium will pick up where tombs are. And obviously the museums have postcodes and things. So in that sense, it's not particularly difficult.
And I imagine there must be some locations and memorials that you would suggest people prioritize to see along
Well,
the way?
certainly, yeah. If people know that they have relations there, you can look them up on the Commonwealth War Graves Commission website, and they will say where the burial can be found. And if there are one of those people who died, like a great uncle of mine, and his body was never recovered, are mentioned on one of the two enormous memorials, either at Thiepval in northern France or over the Belgian border on the Menin Gate in Ypres. My great uncle is on the Thiepval Memorial and has no other grave, but you can check where that is. As far as going to the museums are concerned, some of them are a great deal better than others. There's, particularly in Belgium, I have to say, there's been a little sort of trade in opening a museum by the local farmers.
Oh,
Because historically, the landowners have dug up bodies. And indeed, it still occasionally happens. And there are more military funerals. And so there are museums in people's back gardens or just little bits of trench. But
wow.
the major museums in France and Belgium are extremely good.
Now,
Well worth visiting.
yeah, if you arrive somewhere and in a particular area, a particular battlefield, and you suddenly think, I'd like to know a bit more about this, would there be a sort of local tour that you could pick up for sort of a couple of hours and sort of just take that, perhaps without having booked it ahead?
Not that I'm aware of that you can just drop in on. But there are marked tours in both France and in Belgium, certainly around the First War memorials. Again, it's less marked around the second because there's less to see there. But certainly in the area of the trenches, the Battle of the Somme, that area, there is a marked armistice trip. And the symbol for that is the red poppy, which we're familiar with here. So it's easy to find. And it does take you round the sites of importance. That's an easy thing to follow.
Yeah, I've just been to Belgium, not to see the battlefields, but to look at the Flemish art, actually. But I picked up a book before I went on the Second World War by Norman Stone, which I'm really enjoying reading. So I'm going to ask you to suggest perhaps a great guidebook or just some really good reading that somebody could sort of either look at before they go or take with them that sort of fills them in a bit if they don't have quite so much knowledge about those wars, or the First World War particularly.
I think you've stumped me there, if I'm perfectly honest. I can't think of anything that I know that I'm immediately familiar with, which puts it in an obvious enough way. But nonetheless, following the signs and the links that are available online will help and give you an idea as to where to go, particularly to the really good museums. The one in particular is the Historial de la Grande Guerre at Péronne, which is not just a good museum, it's one of the very best that I know of anywhere. An absolutely magnificent museum dealing with the First War, but dealing with it from a personal point of view. There are individual stories, individual tragedies, as well as bringing on really well enhanced videos, very many episodes of the war to life. And that's well worth it. The other place that links the First and the Second War well together is the museum at Compiègne, where the armistice was signed at the end of World War I, and where Hitler forced the capitulation of France 22 years later in 1940. And those two are in opposite sides of the museum.
Right.
The sleeping car, the train sleeping car, was used for the ceremony on both occasions. And a replica of it, because the original one was damaged in the Second War, but a replica of it is still there in the museum. And one side of the museum deals with the First War, and then it goes on to see on the videos Hitler arriving and accepting the capitulation of France on the second side. But it also makes it clear that the French clearly are almost embarrassed by the fact that they did succumb to France, did succumb to Germany rather, in the Second War. And so it's harder to find more objective material about that as you look around.
It does sound an absolutely fantastic area to discover. Is it a good idea if you're sort of driving across to perhaps, I mean, I know that some people do walking tours, to take your car and then do a walking tour of that, rather than sort of perhaps driving in a car to different to different sites?
Yes, it depends on the sites you want to visit.
Mm.
But certainly, if you've got memorials that you wish to see, a good number of them will frankly involve you in walking regardless. And some of them will fit well into a walking tour. But sometimes the distances are really rather great for that. You've got a distance of 40, 50 kilometers from one good museum centre to another, or there will be plenty of graves en route.
And what about the terrain when you're actually walking to the graves? I mean, would sort of older people need to be careful, have good shoes, take a stick, or is it all?
One or two would, yes.
Mm.
And that's certainly true where they have retained ground, as it were. There's a big Canadian memorial at Beaumont-Hamel, not far from the Tietval Memorial, in fact, where they've left the trenches as near as they were as they could have done. In other places on the Canadian Memorial on Beamy Ridge, the trenches have been rebuilt as they were. But the original ones do give you an impression of just how close things were, and they are well signposted and marked. There is some help with climbing up and over. Going over the top, of course, was one of the last things that so many people did. The very last sight on earth was what they saw, as you see coming up out of the trenches of places like this, like Beaumont and others. But some of that would be difficult for people with disablements. My wife is disabled, and there's certainly some of them that I could not take her to.
And lastly, Alan, if people want to go and sort of, pay their respects and some sort of tribute in a rather nice way, what's the best way to do that?
If they've got a relative that they know about, then the grave is a grave that is your family's grave, as well as being the Commonwealth War Graves Commission grave, and you certainly can leave flowers there. If not, or you don't know, then I would certainly say go to either of the big memorials. It doesn't matter too much which, Tietval or the Menin Gate in Belgium. Tietval is absolutely gigantic. It's very difficult to imagine how huge it is until you are there, with 72,000 members of British forces who died there listed on it, with in fact a grave memorial, a cemetery on either side as well for some people who died locally. And that, the peace there, enables you to contemplate and to honour them well. But at the Menin Gate in Ypres, famously, every night, bar, I think, part of COVID, but perhaps that's a different issue, there is a ceremony there where the Belgians give thanks for the liberation that was brought about by so many British people who are remembered on the gate itself, on the memorial there. Again, people with no known grave. And there is a military remembrance. But both those acts of remembrance are very moving to take part in.
Yes, I'm sure they are. Alan, thank you so much. That's very, very interesting indeed. I'm sure that's given a lot of people some ideas about
It's been a pleasure, and I hope that people think they can plan a trip to see, even if they don't now know that there's a great uncle or a great granddad to see.
Or just even if you don't, haven't lost somebody there, just to go and visit them. It's something I would like to do one day. Anyway, very interesting. Thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate your contribution. Well, not everybody jumps for joy at the thought of driving abroad. Some people don't mind, but other people can get quite sort of nervous about it. So we're going to be joined now, help is at hand, through Kevin and Tracy Field, creators of the Confident Drivers podcast. Kevin and Tracy, welcome to our webinar. Now, before we start, can you just explain to me what actually qualifies you to give advice on driving with confidence?
Hi, yes. Well, I have over 35 years experience in the driving industry, covering all types of vehicles from cars all the way up to big lorries and HGVs. And I'm currently a driver trainer, helping people become more confident in driving, whether that's learners or full license holders as well.
And I've been working in stress management and mindfulness for the past 10 years. And it was about 5 years ago that we decided to combine those areas of expertise. So Kev's practical driving experience with my stress management and confidence experience, and come together to help out anxious drivers.
Now, why is it, do you think, that some people are absolutely happy? I've never, for instance, found it that difficult to drive on the other side of the road. So I find it harder when I come back this time to our country, strangely enough. But some people find it so difficult and get so stressed and worried about it. What do you think causes that?
I think driving anxiety as a whole can be a real combination of factors. So there are some people who just don't get off to a great start with their driving confidence right from the beginning. And that might be their experiences pre-driving. So, you know, sort of like even as children, their experiences of being in the car with family members. And then, of course, there's their learning to drive experience. So whether that went smoothly, whether they had a positive experience with a lovely, you know, teacher, or whether that was a negative experience for them. So all of that can set the foundations before you even begin to think about driving abroad.
And I think it's also practice as well. You know, sometimes people just don't practice enough.
Mm.
Once a week to the local shop and back, maybe they don't do any more than that, and that can lead to anxiety if they have to drive for a longer distance.
And then suddenly they're taking off for a holiday abroad in the car. Yes, I can see that would be quite unnerving. Is it a good thing, though, perhaps to be a little bit nervous? I mean, doesn't that make you just a little bit more sort of careful about what you're doing, or would you agree with that?
Well, I think there's a little bit of nerves is good, but you don't want to be too nervous.
Mm.
And it's very similar to confidence. Confidence is good, but if you're overconfident, it's not so good. So there's a line where
Mm.
some nerves are good and a little bit of confidence is good. So if we can have that focus in the middle somewhere, we're onto a good thing.
Yeah, we don't want people to be so relaxed
Yeah.
that they're not paying attention, that they're not focused on the driving. So that's not great. When you've got that perfect sweet spot of nerves, just where you're focusing, you're paying attention, and it is then all about reinterpreting those feelings so that instead of using that word nerves, actually reinterpreting it and using the words as I'm focused, I'm paying attention on what I'm doing. And actually that's what I'm hoping everybody else on the road is doing too. Where it can be a problem is when somebody gets overly anxious, and then that can start to impact their driving. And so it can impact on performance and decisions and leave them with really negative feelings around driving.
I'm wondering if the pandemic has had an effect, because suddenly people weren't going abroad for a couple of years, you know, perhaps people who went regularly. Has that affected people and how they suddenly approach, you know, taking their car off to Europe?
Yeah, 100%. Because you was told that you can't drive anywhere. I mean, there was limits, wasn't there? You know, like 5 mile limit, you can't drive here. So I think 100% the COVID situation, the pandemic, definitely did have an effect. And it's that phrase, you use it or lose it.
Yeah.
We hear that so much, and I think it was with driving as well. You know, people don't like change, and they got used to not driving as well. So now they're having to drive, and it's like, oh, right, what am I going to do? There's that doubt, that uncertainty creeps in again, and it's like, oh no, and the breathing as well. So
Yeah, and the problem with that doubt and uncertainty is that that's where the nerves come from. Our brains really dislike doubt, uncertainty. Our brains like habit. Our brains like consistency. We like to know what it is that we're going to do. So as soon as we get that doubt and uncertainty creep in due to change, which you know, the pandemic, there was a lot of change in all sorts of things, then that makes you feel more stressed and anxious when you make that change, not to mention the life stress. So we were all living through a very stressful period of time. And so if we've got other things going on in our life, and then we're trying to add in driving abroad as well, while we might be thinking about what are the rules here, are they different to home, or worrying about getting COVID and what about face masks, then that additional life stress makes you feel more anxious while driving.
Sadly, I'm not planning to go abroad at the moment, but let's imagine that I am. Give me some tips on what I should do. Give me just several tips about being relaxed, confidence boosting, just how I should generally approach that trip.
Well, I think it's that prepare for what you're going to be expecting. You're going to probably go on a plane. Some people drive abroad. Some people, go on holiday and pick up a car. I know we're talking about it a little bit later, but familiarize yourself. That's the first thing. If you get that car, familiarize yourself with it. But also route plan. That can really have a good background for you just to go, I know what I'm doing. I know where I'm going. And I know Neil earlier didn't know where he was going to charge, and he did. For some people, that would cause anxiety, not knowing. So I think sometimes you've got to be what works for you. And I think planning something can actually have a big benefit into the way you drive, the way you feel, and the confidence will come from that because you've planned lots of different things.
It's giving yourself options, isn't it? So that if things don't go according to the original plan, at least if you have an idea where you're going, have an idea of maybe a couple of options where you might stop, take a break, then all of that can help you be more flexible.
You've reminded me of a time when I landed in America late at night and hired a car. I was with a boyfriend at the time, and we knew the hotel was only about 5 minutes from where we were, but we couldn't find it. It was just this endless expanse of darkness that went on and on and on and on. Had to find a police car in the end to help. It was very scary when that happens. So perhaps you'd advise maybe not arriving at night to hire a car, maybe make sure you arrive in the daytime.
Well, yeah, but the simple thing for me for there was if you are going to get at night time and things are going to be harder to see and find, why not get a taxi from the airport and sort the car out the next morning? You've had a night's sleep as well then as well.
That's a good, I wish we'd done that. Now, lastly, I want to know about your podcast. How do we find it? How do we listen to it? And what are the current topics that you're highlighting?
Okay, so to find the podcast, if you just search Driving Confidence as the search term on any podcast player, then it will just pop up and you'll see our faces on there. And also you can search for it on Amazon. So if people don't normally listen to podcasts, then have a search on Amazon and it will come up on their podcast player as well. And then topics we've talked about all sorts of things.
Blue light aware. James done a talk with us, but also very simple things like when you're normally driving, like hill starts. So it's the practical skills with driving as well. So, we talk about anything and everything. And some of it's actually from listeners as well saying, look, can you talk about this for me?
Yeah, asking for advice. And a few mystery bits in there as well. So a few mystery topics that people might not think of, but that can relate to driving anxiety.
An example of that would be sleep. We had a sleep expert on talking about how sleep could affect your driving.
So good thing to do. We don't have to wait to go abroad to look at your podcast. I'm going to. Is there a kind of length for it, for a particular podcast? I mean, or does it just kind of keep going?
But it normally lasts roughly about 15 to 20 minutes, but we do like talking, and if our guests are talking, they do tend to go on to about 45.
Yeah, so they vary, don't they, depending.
Well, it's great. Thank you so much. I must say it's very nice to know about your podcast, Confident Drivers Podcast. And that was Kevin and Tracy. Thank you both so much for talking to us.
Thank you.
Right, now we're going to go off to France because we're going to do a trip with the editor of the Good Motoring magazine, James Luckhurst, and he's going to sort of share his experiences of a recent drive across to the Alps. And he's also going to share a selection of rather unusual traffic rules that he came across in Europe. So over now to James, who is rather flying high in the world.
Thanks for tuning in. Welcome to this little guide on driving in Europe. My name's James Luckhurst, editor of Good Motoring, and I thought I'd use this opportunity to do my little introductions and bits and pieces connected with this report from a cable car in La Plagne. It's the 5th of April. As you can see, lower ground behind me, getting a bit green now, but loads of snow in the past few days. And I have brought a few family members here from our home in Mid Wales. Fair old journey, but with planning, it was just fun. There was no stress. Our trip took us from around the Hay and Wye area as far as Ashford in Kent on Thursday, just before Easter. stopped the evening and overnight in Ashford at the Premier Inn just off the M20, struggled with hundreds of others to get through the Channel Tunnel on Good Friday morning, but it was okay. We were calm. We had no rush. And the good thing about it is that our ticket was Flexi Plus, which meant we knew that as soon as we got through the formalities of the tunnel, we'd be able to go straight onto the first train that was coming through. So that got us to the Coquelle end of the Channel Tunnel, and from there straight onto the motorway network for around 6 hours to Beaune, just north of Lyon. And we stayed in Beaune on Friday night, very comfortable, and then it was just a 4-hour drive from Beaune across through Chambéry, up through Albertville, and to La Flamme, which is where we were staying, getting on for about 2,000 metres above sea level, which is probably a good idea when you want to do late season skiing. But I tell you what, let's now take a look at some of the things you need to know about driving in France.
In France, you drive on the right. The motorway speed limit for cars is 130 kilometers an hour. This is reduced to 110 when it's wet. Cars towing caravans are subject to lower limits, with clear signposting in the appropriate locations. If you're in your own car rather than a rental car, you're likely to need to display a UK sticker. These replaced the GB stickers in 2021. An observation: French motorways tend to have 2 rather than 3 lanes, so be very disciplined in your overtaking. Move back to the right-hand lane as soon as you've completed an overtake, and be ready for impatient drivers to get dangerously close to your rear, even if there's a queue of traffic in front of you. Be aware that on some French roads, the traditional priorité à droite, that's priority to the right, that practice is still followed, even though it may no longer be legal. In theory these days, the rule no longer applies unless it's clearly signed. In practice, though, it makes sense to anticipate a driver pulling out in front of you, even though the priority may be yours. The practice of flashing headlights at a junction in France does not mean the same thing as it might in the UK. If another motorist flashes his headlights at you, he's telling you that he has priority and will be coming through in front of you. By the way, don't be tempted to exceed speed limits on the autoroute. The police have the power to confiscate your car, make you pay on the spot, or to take your license and give you an immediate ban.
Well, I hope that was a useful guide to driving in France. What we're now going to do is look at Europe in general and some of the quirkier rules that you might want to know about before getting behind the wheel. Starting in Spain, where it's against the law to drive in flip-flops if they're deemed to be compromising your grip on the pedals. There's a fine of €200, so do ensure you have appropriate footwear in the car. Also in Spain, don't drive shirtless, however hot it might be. This is due to the possibility of injury should the seatbelt be required in an emergency. Expect a fine of up to €100 for non-compliance. In Germany, it's against the law to run out of fuel on the motorway. The only reason you're allowed to stop on the German Autobahn is for emergency purposes, and running out of petrol, diesel or battery charge doesn't cut it. In France, all cars must now be kitted out with high-vis jackets for every passenger, as well as a warning triangle in case of emergencies. Keep a spare set of specs with you in the car, whether it's your own vehicle or rented, if you're driving in Spain, Germany, France or Switzerland. This is to ensure that all drivers can maintain good vision in case their main pair of glasses gets damaged or lost. In Portugal, if you're towing a caravan, you must have a current inventory of the caravan's contents to show a police officer if requested. And finally, in Ireland, taking your pet out of your vehicle during a breakdown is illegal. This is in spite of recommendations for motorists that have broken down that they should evacuate all the occupants. Rules of the road state you should keep your pet in the car in an emergency in an attempt to control its behaviour. Some of the stranger rules that apply in different parts of Europe, in different countries, and it's worth being aware of them. Ignorance is no defence if you get stuck or stopped by the police. Right, finally, just a checklist of things that you should think about and take with you. Make sure you pack and prepare in advance before you go on your European driving trip.
We'll summarise with a few hints and tips relating to overseas driving rules. Make sure you're familiar with the rules in other countries, including the local speed limits and drink driving laws. Depending on the country you're visiting, you may need extra equipment such as reflective jackets and a warning triangle in many countries. Also, emission stickers in some European cities. You may need to buy these weeks before you go abroad, so do check. And ensure you have headlight converter stickers. Pre-journey checks? Get the car serviced. Also, check tyres, lights and liquids. Minimise the risk of any kind of malfunction while you're away. Check your passports will be valid for the entire trip. Check your travel tickets are in order and purchase European breakdown cover. Plan the route. Build in time for breaks on long journeys. Don't go for too long without a break. And from everyone here, have a great trip.
Well, look, my cable car ride's coming to the end. I was very lucky to be on my own. It's late in the afternoon and all the family members have decided that enough's enough for the day, but I wanted one more run. And in a moment, I will just have that run. But hopefully that was a useful look at driving in Europe. I'll hand you back now to Val.
That was very, very useful indeed, James. Thank you very much. A lot of things that I certainly didn't know about there. The only thing you didn't say was what the rules are about talking on your mobile phone in a car, but I can ask him that a bit later. Right, that was great. James, all alone in a French cable car. Well, now it's time to meet Keith Smith-Dutton, a GEM member and an experienced motorhome owner. Keith has travelled all over the UK and Europe in motorhomes, and we're very pleased to welcome you now, Keith, to our programme. First of all, can you sum up the benefits of having a motorhome?
I think the main benefit for me is the freedom of travel, is that, although we generally have some sort of idea in mind where we're going to, sometimes we abandon that just to follow the sun. If it's sunnier on the west coast and the east coast, then we may head over in that direction and enjoy whatever there is over there. We're great fans of National Trust and English or Scottish heritage, historic Scotland, English heritage and such like. So we often visit a lot of these places on the way.
What's your motorhome like inside? I mean, do you kind of make it a home from home?
Yes, we do. Yeah. I tend to go probably a little bit further than most people. I have no problems with putting a hole in the roof to put an aerial on there for internet connection and such like. I'll change things about sometimes, cut into cupboards or whatever it takes to make the place that much more suitable for ourselves, for whatever it is we want to do. Some people, of course, won't do that because it might be affecting the value, but it never really does.
I have some friends with a motorhome, and when they park, they could sort of open the side up, kind of extend it, which was fantastic. Were you able to do that with yours?
No, mine's not quite that sophisticated, but we do have a lot of room inside ours. There's so many different designs of motorhomes that we like to have a nice big lounge area. We could seat 8 people, which we sometimes do, if we're at meetings with the Motor Caravanners Club, for example. And, we have a drop-down bed. It's electronic drop-down bed, comes down in the middle of the van, right the way down, and it's like a massive playground. It's quite a large bed, certainly more than adequate.
Any hairy moments you can share with us along the way of your travels in motorhomes?
Yes, I'd about 20 years ago, so I'd just taken delivery of a brand new left-hand drive motorhome, and ourselves and 3 other friends in their motorhomes went across to do Austria, have a look at Austria. So we motored down from Scotland, took the ferry across to Bremerhaven, went down through Germany into Austria, and then just on the second sort of major mountain that we came to, going downhill, second gear, certainly very aware of things like brake fade and that when you're in a big vehicle. Put my foot on the brakes, nothing happened, went straight down to the floor.
Oh.
And so I lost my brakes completely.
My gosh.
Had a friend in front of me. He was about 30, 40 yards ahead of me, who was an ex-heavy goods driver. And we had CBs. So my wife got on the CB to him, told him what had happened. And we made a quick plan that he would match my speed and gradually slow down so that I would go into the back of him and he would stop for both of us. Fortunately, it didn't come to that. Just as I was getting close behind him, he said, lay-by, right, go. And I saw this lay-by, went into it. And of course, it was one of these lay-bys designed for trucks that are out of control.
Oh, wow.
And so it had an incline going up the way. So I took that lay-by, heaving on the handbrake, and we stopped just about 2 meters away from a group of trees.
Oh my gosh, that was
So
pretty.
it was quite hairy.
Yeah, I bet it was Harry. You were very lucky there by the sound of it. Now, the other thing, you sort of said you go off when, that looks nice over there, you're going. But I always understood that you really ought to know where you're going to stay the night. I mean, can you just sort of park up, in any lay-by or along the side of a road if you want to, or do you have to go somewhere special to put your motorhome in at night?
Well, these days it pays to have a smartphone because there's so many apps that will give you overnight stops. Germany and France are absolutely great. They are very much oriented towards motorhomes. In France, you get air détente, where these are little parking places specifically for motorhomes. And some of them have got, for a couple of euros, you can empty your toilet, you can take on 100 liters of water, empty your grey water. So top and tail the van, ready for, the next 3 or 4 days. There's just about every small town, some of the villages and that have these sort of airs, because they know that motorhomers will spend money in the local economy. In Germany, they're called Stellplatz, and in all the sort of touristy areas in Germany, you find plenty of Stellplatz. The UK is quite far behind everybody else, but it's gradually coming around now. Instead of being viewed as pariahs in the UK, a lot of the local authorities are starting to realize that if they put in the facilities for motorhomes, we invest in the local community. But yeah, there's apps you can look at. I mean, when we go down to England, for example, we're up in mid Scotland. There's an outfit called Brit Stops, and this is a collection of pubs, restaurants, farm shops, all this sort of thing that will allow you to spend the night for free. They do like you to go in for a beer or something to eat or buy something if it's farm shop or whatever. But yeah, all these places are often free of charge. We don't go to a lot of sites. A site's going to cost you 30, 40, 50 pound a night in some of these places. So in a motorhome, because you're so self-contained for about 3 or 4 days, then you can avoid it.
I was going to actually ask you if you needed to plan, but it sounds as if you've got everything sort of, touch of a mobile, exactly where you're going to be. So you don't need to plan every single sort of stop for the night. You can be, much more sort of flexible about it, really, can't you?
Yes, we can be very flexible. I mean, normally, if we're going to plan something, we plan a trip with a theme.
Yeah.
Like one year, we visited all the Tudor properties we could find in England and Scotland. I was building a Tudor doll's house, so I wanted some ideas. So yeah, we visited all the old Tudor places and that.
It sounds fascinating, Keith. Thank you so much for telling us about that. Wonder how many sort of people are sitting out there thinking, maybe I'll just try a motorhome for my next trip. Very interesting. And as you say, it's one of the great adventures that you've had. Thank you for contributing today.
That's great. Thank you.
Now going to go back to Neil very quickly, Neil, because you're going to share with us some tips about hiring a car abroad. First-time customer, would you say it's hire a car much the same as the one that you might drive at home, same sort of power, size, for instance?
Yeah, I mean, I've listened to Kevin and Tracy there earlier, and they said, yeah, there's a variety of different confidence levels, and I wouldn't want to say that, one size fits all. But yes, you're driving in a foreign country, usually on the other side of the road, different controls. Do you really want all of that complication as well as as well as being in a foreign country? No, stick to what you know, and that will be one less thing to worry about.
What about sort of documents that you should have with you, or can you plan a lot of it when you're sitting at home before you actually go?
Yeah, most hire companies will want to see them, but yes, you can plan in advance, and you can go onto the DVLA website. You can print a piece of paper called a driving record, as most people will know. Your endorsements now, your penalties are all stored electronically, so you can go on, you can put your national insurance number in and your postcode and a few other details, and print that sheet out. And that sheet will also, you'll hand that to them with your photocard driving license, but also there'll be a special code that they can type in to a website to check it themselves. So those are the key documents, but you may be asked to provide, a credit card rather than a debit card, so they can take a deposit for the insurance and that sort of thing. But every hire company does have slight differences, so just check with who you're hiring with.
Will they try and sell you an insurance? I think I remember that happening rather a lot. And is that a good thing to take, or can you say, no, you don't want it?
You can say no, but it's really worth checking out what they offer. And it's also worth checking out what your credit card or your bank account provides, because some people will have quite a comprehensive foreign car hire package with that. And you don't want to duplicate, you don't want to pay for the same insurance twice, but do check very carefully, check the wording, check the exclusions, how many days you're allowed to be abroad. And compare that with what the car hire company offers. It's just worth double checking that you don't have all of those things before you go for the car hire one. But yes, there's a right to refuse most of what the car hire company is offering if you feel you're covered elsewhere, or of course if you're happy to take the risk.
Now, I've always loved hiring a car and just taking off and exploring, and I'm worried now. I've just had another birthday a week ago. It wasn't long ago in the Scilly Isles where they wouldn't actually let me hire a golf buggy because I was too old. So I'm a bit nervous. I know, ridiculous. And I'm driving a sports car in this country. I'm a bit nervous that they're going to say, sorry, you're just a bit too old to hire a car. Is that a problem now for people?
It's not a problem, Valerie, but there are some complications. Just as there's quite a high minimum age for some of the hire companies. Some of them do have a cut-off of around 75 usually. And it doesn't mean that you can't hire the car. It just means there's extra checks. Now, I've got a sheet of paper here, which is some of Avis's rules. And you can see that it's all in capitals. It is actually all in capitals on their website. Not massively friendly, but just very, very quickly, some of the things that over 75s might need to provide. A letter from the insurance company to say that you drive regularly and not had an accident in the past 5 years. A letter from the doctor, which might be a complicated one to get. So do check with the hire company in case that's needed, because they do need to confirm you're in good health. And here's the interesting one, especially for people that might have been driving for 40 years. The hire company reserves the right to sit in with you for 5 or 10 minutes to check that you're competent. So I think a few people might have a bit of an issue with that one if they've had a few decades of blemish-free driving, Valerie.
So would you say Avis is one of the best rental companies to go for? I mean, I won't tell you what my birthday was I've just had, but it's a bit more than 75.
Oh, okay. Well, I would never ask, obviously, but Avis and Hertz are ones I've happened to use. Okay. I've had reasonably good service with those. They're well known around the world, and they do have loyalty schemes. So if you do get bitten by the bug and you travel a lot, you can build up a few loyalty points with them and maybe get a free hire in the future. So I'd say go with a household name, because you've got a lot of protections that a worldwide sort of company offers.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Neil. Right, lots and lots and lots of useful information we've had from all our various contributors. And I think we've actually got just a few minutes to have one or two questions that we've had put into us before we started. Right now, here's Mrs. Wodge in Durham, and any of you can answer this. What's your favourite way of reaching the continent? Who wants to answer that one? Just one of you.
Generally by ferry. I prefer to take the day trip ferry, usually about 4 hours across to France. And yeah, I have done the tunnel. I quite like the tunnel, but the ferry generally I find a lot more relaxing.
Now, this is somebody who wants to know. This is Pam Wilson from Ipswich. It says, what do I do with a husband who's overconfident behind the wheel? We're driving to Sorrento in July. So I think that's Kevin and Tracy. Quick replies from you all now, because sadly we're nearly near an end of our webinar.
I would say she could take the plane, but I don't think that answers her question. I think it's having a conversation. If she's not feeling up for that, just have a conversation with him and say, look, I'd rather you slow down.
Trying to put across her feelings in a non-blaming way. So this is how I feel when we do this. Can we compromise?
Yeah.
And now I think Maria Legg says she's worried about the long distances involved in a touring holiday. And again, I think this is probably for you, Kevin and Tracy. What tips do you have for guarding against fatigue?
There's lots. Look at what you're eating to start with as well.
Yeah.
So caffeine intake as well. If you're having caffeine later in the afternoon, early evening, that's going to keep you awake as well. So, you'll find it harder to sleep at night.
There's a difference between tiredness and sleepiness. So keeping a real eye on that. So if you haven't managed to have a good night's sleep and maybe you were feeling sleepy, then putting in those very regular breaks, taking a nap when you take that break to get rid of some of the sleepiness to keep you safer, as well as caffeine.
Yeah.
Neil, would you like to sort of contribute to that question?
Yeah, I think, well, go somewhere where it's light later into the evening, or, preferably go somewhere it's light 24/7. That's another option. The daylight will help. But I think that's the main thing. Don't stretch yourself too much, especially if it's a first or a second trip. It's just about getting into a groove with it and making sure that you can cope with those long distances. Because as we've heard there's a difference between the different types of fatigue, and it's important to recognize the signs as well. But yeah, I mean, my tip would be go somewhere where, if you're going to drive long distances, make sure there's enough daylight to help you with that, because again, that's it. The worry about it getting dark is anxiety driving in itself. So just be wary of that.
Like Scandinavia for you. Now I'm going to ask you all a very quick question. One answer. Where would you never visit again? Matthew Ayres in Lancaster wants to know that. So I'm going to start. Neil, where would you never go again?
I don't think I would like to drive much in Malta again, purely because some of the drivers there scared me a bit.
Okay. Kevin and Tracy?
I think Athens for us. It was so hot and it was just unbearable. Yeah.
Yeah.
Alan?
Getting stuck on the periphery going around Paris.
Round Paris. Right.
On the ring road.
Yeah. Keith, where would you never visit again?
You mean apart from the M25? Probably Rome. No, Rome.
Not the M25 at the moment, certainly.
Yeah, Rome wasn't a great place for a motorhome. We parked outside and ended up using scooters to go in. But certainly I wouldn't take a motorhome through Rome.
Okay.
Right. Well, thank you all very much for your ideas of where never to go again. Sadly, that brings us to the end of our webinar for today. I do hope you found it thought-provoking and inspiring, and it's given you some ideas of where you might head off for your next trip in Europe. If you want to share the recording again with friends, or perhaps just have a look at it to remind you of bits of it, you'll find it very soon up on the Older Drivers Forum website. That's olderdriverforum.com. So our sincere thanks to you for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to join us again, we'll have another webinar a little bit later in the year, so keep a watch out for that. And our theme then will be keeping fit while you're driving, looking at your eyesight, and just different themes for making sure that you're safe to drive. A big thank you to Rob Hurd for the Older Drivers Forum, and to all our guests who are absolutely great, very interesting indeed, and of course to our producer, James Luckhurst. So from me for now, Valerie Singleton, it's just time to say goodbye and look forward very much to joining you again sometime later in the year. Bye for now.